Good evening, everyone. We would like to start. Pizza corner, please. Welcome, everyone. So this is the faculty debate between Duncan Kennedy, the Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence and the author of A Critique of Adjudication, Noah Feldman, the Bemis Professor of Law and author of The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, and will be moderated by Frank Michelman, the Robert Wellesley University Professor and author of Brennan and Democracy. As I said, this is the fourth. The first one was March 2008 on nation building in Iraq after the war. And the second, November 2008, the future of U.S. foreign policy and Israel-Palestine. And the third, October 2010, on the one-state or two-state solution. And today, can Israel be both Jewish and democratic? I would like to thank the sponsors and the organizers of this debate, Justice for Palestine at Harvard Law School, and the co-sponsors, the Human Rights Program, International Legal Studies, Unbound, Journal of the Legal Left, and the National Lawyers Guild at Harvard Law School. One last remark, the debate will be videotaped, so if you decide to participate, take that into account, and please refrain from outside unauthorized recordings. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to introduce and open up the topic, and then we'll get to our featured speakers. Can Israel be both Jewish and democratic? The topic obviously comes out of the declared undertaking of the State of Israel to maintain herself as a state that is both Jewish and democratic. You can read the commitment in Israel's basic laws. You can see it figuring in decisions of the courts, and of course, you can see it figuring also more widely in Israel's political controversies and discussions. In relation to that undertaking, I'm going to suggest there are two somewhat different kinds of questions that one might take up. One sort of question has to do with ideal political conceptions. One might, for example, ask, on the correct or ideal conception of a democratic state, can such a state also, at the same time, be in some distinct and non-trivial sense a dedicatedly Jewish state? Or conversely, on whatever we take to be the appropriate conception of Israel as a distinctly Jewish state, can it then also be, in some robust sense, a democratic state? Now, I can tell you from past exposure to this sort of questions, I know how it can all too easily degenerate to a game of definitions. You define democracy thinly and weakly enough, and a state that's Jewish in a quite thick and strong sense can also easily be classed as democratic. And vice versa, if you define Jewish state to mean nothing more than a state that's animated by a certain set of universal humanist values, then every state that's Jewish, by that definition, will already also be a state that's democratic in the most demanding sense of the term that even Ronald Dworkin mentioned in the program for this event would propose. So the discussion, I think, really gets more interesting when we go to definitions on both sides of the equation, that is, definitions of both Jewish and democratic, that are each sufficiently robust and demanding as to appear to be getting in each other's way, as apparently to cause some kind of trouble for each other. And that's the terrain on which I fully expect Professors Feldman and Kennedy will quickly take us in this discussion. Now, I said there was a second sort of question that the topic invites, and I mean a question not so much about ideals as about consequences. We can, and I expect our discussants will, ask about the consequences for citizens of Israel of the country's pursuit of the dual commitment, Jewish and democratic, through its policies, its laws, its constitutional discourses, and adjudications. And the focus then may naturally fall on the Jewish side of the puzzle, because the democratic part will just be taken by most of us to be non-problematic and benign. No problem about democratic in terms of consequences for citizens of Israel. It's the Jewish side of the question that seems to be more naturally associated with that question. And from that, we can see also that the focus will fall mainly on consequences for the non-Jewish fraction of Israel's citizenry, and specifically those identified as Arab or Palestinian. So there, as I understand the matter, are two quite closely related sorts of questions that our topic for this evening suggests. One's about how most aptly to conceive or to develop the meanings of Jewish and democratic as applied to the case of Israel. And one is about how Israel's constitutional commitment to do just that can be expected to bear, for better or for worse, on the conditions of life of non-Jewish and specifically Arab citizens of Israel. Now here's how we're going to proceed. We're going to have initial statements of approximately 20 minutes, first from Professor Kennedy. I think that's the order agreed on. Then from Professor Feldman. Then I'm going to see whether either of them has a question or two that he would like to direct to the other. Then it's possible that the moderator will have a question to direct to each speaker. We'll have to see how that develops. And then we will open the floor for your queries, questions, comments, interventions, and so on.
Let me see if I can get the mic in the right relation. Am I audible? Am I feeding back? Okay. So thank you for coming. It's a great turnout, and I'm really delighted to be here. It's great to have Frank as a moderator. I actually start sort of the way Frank does. I don't think there's much profit in the merely semantic discussion. So maybe I should say what strikes me as worth it in addressing the question of the relationship between Jewishness in Israel and democracy. In the recent past, it's become a major negotiating demand, though how exactly to interpret it is unclear, of the Netanyahu government, that the Palestinian Authority, as a condition of entering negotiations, accept or acknowledge that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, that Israel is a Jewish state. So it's become an actual part of the negotiation of the politics of the situation as a very significant demand. At the same time, in the United States, in the activities of advocates and opponents of the current status quo in Israel-Palestine, it's become a very important part of the position of AIPAC, but also of other elements of the Israel lobby, that the Jewishness of the state is an absolutely central and legitimate demand in negotiations. For example, just yesterday, with respect to a one-state conference, that is, on Saturday, there's a one-state conference at the Kennedy School, which is about looking at various alternatives to a two-state solution that would involve a single Israeli state government, maybe federalized with various kinds of safeguards for minorities and majorities. So Abe Foxman wrote, the dean of the Kennedy School, Dean Elwood. He said the following: you can see how the concept of the Jewish character of the state is now going to be a significant part of academic and political debate in the US. Well, Dean Elwood's statement expressed disappointment to see that the initial list of speakers is so one-sided. This conference is so fundamentally flawed that balance cannot cure it. this conference goes beyond academic discourse about the conflict by promoting the elimination of the Jewish state. The conference is about the possible one-state solution, which would be a binational state in some sense. Although the conference organizers state that one of their goals for the conference is to, quote, help expand the range of academic debate on this issue, there can never be any legitimate discussion of a concept which by its very nature will result in the end of the Jewish character of Israel. So the thing that's interesting here, that I find interesting, is the question, what's meant by the Jewish character of the state? What does it mean to make it a central political demand that there should be a recognition, in this case by the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but also, again, a possible loyalty oath proposal for the inside Israel is that all Arab citizens of Israel should have to swear that they agree to and accept the Jewish character of the state. So it's a hot issue, the question of how we should understand the Jewish character, and in relation to democracy, it's just a way of orienting ourselves to asking what aspect of Jewishness are relevant and interesting in various ways. So Frank mentioned the foundational commitments of the Israeli state. Here is the Declaration of Independence. It is the natural right of the Jewish people to lead, as do all other nations, an independent existence in its sovereign state. So that's the Declaration of Independence. Then says, the state of Israel will be open to the immigration of Jews from all countries of their dispersion, will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. That's very significant, all its inhabitants, will be based on the principles of liberty, justice, and peace as conceived by the prophets of Israel, will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of religion, race, or sex, will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, education, and culture, will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and will loyally uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter. So that's an example of what Frank was referring to as a very formal official. The word democracy is not in there, and there was some discussion about it and decided not to put it in, but I don't know enough about it to interpret that event in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Now, just to get you a sense of the paradoxes that are involved in this discussion, here is Article 7A of the Basic Law. No list of candidates will participate in elections to the Knesset, and no individual will be a candidate for elections to the Knesset if among the goals or acts of the list or among the acts of the person is included, as might be the case explicitly or implicitly, any one of the following. 1, denial of the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So I hope you sense the extreme, complex, almost mind-bending particular which you are forbidden either explicitly or implicitly to work in a way that's based on the denial of the Jewish and democratic character of the state. And here is Justice Barak interpreting the law, upholding it, though rejecting its application in a particular case. What then are the, quote, core, unquote, characteristics that constitute the minimum definition of the state of Israel as a Jewish state? These characteristics have both a Zionist and a heritage aspect. At their center stands the right of every Jew to immigrate to the state of Israel, in which Jews will constitute a majority. Hebrew is the main official language of the state, and most of its holidays and symbols reflect the national revival of the Jewish people, and the Jewish heritage is a major element of its religious and cultural heritage. So that's, I think Frank was referring to that, that's a very thin definition of Jewishness, but it does contain the statement, there is a Jewish majority, and it does contain the right of return, and it does. The relationship between the right of return and the Jewish majority is obviously that the right of return is in part designed to make it possible to have a Jewish majority, not that it doesn't have many other goals. And so what if we wanted to give a more real definition of what Abe Foxman, for example, or Netanyahu are talking about when they talk about the Jewish character of the state. Now, they're referring not to the ideal Jewish character of the state or the state in relation to an ideal conception of democracy. They're talking about the Jewishness of the state and how would a Palestinian, for example, might a Palestinian characterize the state of Israel as a Jewish state? Or how might we, as outside observers, if we're outsiders, when we looked at it, would we say, is the state a Jewish state or not? Well, we might look to this kind of very abstract criteria of Jewishness, but in a much more politically realist way. Now, not the ethical discussion, but just a strictly realistic way, we might characterize Israel as a Jewish state because it is politically controlled. The state apparatus, the legislative and administrative and judicial processes are controlled by Jews, politically organized in political parties that self-consciously affirm their Jewish character for the most part, not all of them. And that would be one factor. And because when we look at the policies, the actions, and the actual regime created by this government, these Jewish governments, we can see it's obvious that they deal constantly with conflicts of interest between the Jewish majority and the Palestinian minority of Arab citizens of Israel. So as a matter of fact, the state is Jewish not now talking ethically, not talking theoretically, just talking in a very concrete way. Now, I would say that it's obvious that Israel can be Jewish and democratic in many loose senses. So it can have a majority Jewish population. And can the United States be Christian and democratic in that sense? I mean, obviously it's possible. I would agree with Frank, actually, that the reference to the prophets of Israel in the declaratory thing, like saying Sharia is the basis of all law in a Muslim country, poses no problem because that's so open that it's totally consistent with a passionate commitment to democracy. So I don't think there's an issue there. I think it's perfectly plausible for Sharia or the prophets of Israel to be the basis of all the law of the state and for the state to be democratic. And I think who cares about holidays is my outside observer. I recognize an Arab citizen of Israel might care a lot about that, but when I'm thinking about it, that's not what I'm thinking about. So what about the more concrete characteristics of this state in real life as a Jewish state? I think this is what the conflict over recognizing the Jewish character of the state is about. It's a demand to recognize the legitimacy of a course of institution-building legislation and action since 1948, to recognize the legitimacy of the outcome, to recognize the legitimacy of Israel is the state of the Jewish people. The state of the Jewish people is to recognize the legitimacy of the outcome. So now, here's the way my take on this starts from then a brief narrative of the outcome brought about by the Jewish state. Thinking of it as a Jewish state, meaning controlled by Jews, legislative, administrative, and judicially, pursuing a long course of state building and society building. So the first thing would be, though this is, so to speak, the pre-state moment, is the state is all there as a pre-state, is the process by which somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 Palestinians left the territory of the current state of Israel. And I think, there's consensus that a lot of them were driven out. Some of them may have decided just to disappear, but a very large number of them were driven out. That's less significant for this purpose than the decision to confiscate their land. So the Israeli state, acting through the Jewish National Fund and the Jewish Agency, confiscated the land of the Palestinians. There were 150,000 Palestinians left, maybe 700,000 of them were expelled or left. Jews owned something like 11% of the land at that moment, and then after the confiscation, these Jewish institutions owned 87% of the land, and what they then did was they restricted its sale or access to non-Jews. So the 87% of the territory was restricted to Jews. This is another way of conceptualizing a Jewish state. It's a state which, through a process of self-defense in war, then producing a massive disappearance of the original local population, can't use the word original, sorry, the people who were there then confiscated the land and put it under a legal regime. We're not talking policy, we're talking law. A legal regime that required that no Palestinian could own it. And the question of whether they could lease it was a complicated legal ethical issue in the regime. So the confiscation process is basic. Then, since then, Israel has formal democracy, any thin definition totally has formal democracy. It has one man, one vote, one person, one vote. It has universal suffrage, et cetera, et cetera. But here's a second dimension of Israel as a Jewish state. There has never been participation of a Palestinian political party in the government of the state of Israel. So there are Jewish parties who have few. There's one party, the Communist Party, tried to be biracial. The political regime of the state of Israel is based on an agreement among the Jewish parties that they will never form a government in their own democratic conflicts with each other that includes Palestinian parties. So the Palestinians are simply excluded from the electoral system of the state of Israel, except they're members of the Knesset. They can vote. In an occasional conflict, it might not be important enough for the Jewish parties to care whether the deciding vote was cast by Palestinian members of the Knesset. But the basic regime does not include, at the level of the state, participation in the executive or administrative affairs of the nation, representative Palestinian groups. They are simply excluded. Again, I'm not trying to play a democracy definition game, because I think you could say, by a thin definition of democracy, that's not a problem. You don't have the votes. It is true that the Israeli Supreme Court has committed itself to a more robust defense of the rights of Palestinians, the equality rights and the non-discrimination rights of Palestinians, or did up to the relatively recent past. But it's also true that, for example, this is a crucial example, when the court struck down the formal prohibition of non-Jewish ownership of 87% of the land in Israel, they struck it down more than 10 years ago. Everyone agrees, first, that it has been the decision has been more or less reversed many times, and it's completely unenforced. So that the regime of the seizure of the territory, followed by the exclusion of Arab citizens of Israel from the possibility of ownership, is still a overwhelming characteristic of the system. And now let me add just another dimension. So the state is Jewish in another sense, in the sense that it devotes its resources to the welfare of its Jewish citizens in a way that is radically unequal vis-a-vis the welfare of its non-Jewish citizens. Nobody denies this. Budgetary allocations for things like education are skewed in a very dramatic way, often through devices that are very similar to those that prevailed in the United States. In fact, one reason why the democracy debate is so amusing is that almost everything that you can say, actually, about what's problematic from an American point of view about the Israeli political regime is true of the United States to one degree or another as well. So there's no issue where the United States would come off scot-free if we use the word democracy to knock all these things down. In the United States, our legal order is dramatically and grotesquely skewed in many ways. In fact, many of the characteristics of our racial order before Brown are now characteristic of the racial order of Israel. That is, the Israeli system looks like Jim Crow, not apartheid. It looks like Jim Crow, not like apartheid, or like the early days of the civil rights movement before the Warren Court had any very substantial impact on the allocation of goods and recognition between. Now, here's just one more aspect, another aspect which might cause us to say that the state of Israel is a Jewish state, would be the policies that it has adopted vis-a-vis the occupied territories. And there are two aspects of the policy, one very familiar, the other perhaps less familiar. So on the first level, the Jewishness of the state is obviously a major explanation of the fighting of a war, which the 1967 war, however we conceive of it as a war of self-defense or as not a war of self-defense, it was fought by a Jewish state to defend the Jewish territory. It involved the seizure of Arab lands, both in the West Bank and Gaza. The seizure was justified on grounds of the security of the Jewish state in its Jewish character. And it was also justified on the grounds that the territories seized were in some large sense available for seizure with an ethical justification, particularly the Likud justification. So Likud was very open about the idea that the seizure was motivated by the desire to restore the integrity of a conception of a Jewish state. That was not the majority view until they became the dominant party. But right from the beginning, that was their line. They objected to the majority explanation of what they were doing. And then the Jewish state pursued the policy of settling the occupied territories. Some 600,000 in the occupied territories in Jerusalem of Jews were encouraged intensely and then protected, and a whole system was developed. This is a Jewish state. It's not a plausible thing that would be happening unless we have the idea of Jewishness as an explanation of what was done. Not because it's intrinsic to Jewishness to be aggressive, but because, as a matter of fact, the particular Jews who controlled the state had a set of policies, and they may have even been justified policies. I'm not even arguing that it was wrong to occupy the occupied territories. I'm not even arguing that it was wrong to settle them with 600,000 settlers. What I'm saying is we're talking about the Jewish character, the current Jewish character of the state. Now, I think every one of these things could be abolished and gotten rid of. It would be possible, and it would be totally consistent with Judaism. In fact, in the high version, Frank's high version, the prophets, according to me, would not have approved. The prophets would have profoundly denounced, and Ilan Pappé is just a Jewish prophet playing the Jewish denunciatory role when he'll be here on Saturday to do that. So according to me, the prophets, so it's nothing to do with Jewishness, and it's also not ethnic in the sense that there have been many, many Jews opposing every one of these dimensions from the very beginning. So it's got nothing to do with being Jewish. On the other hand, when it is said that we, as Americans observing the negotiation process, or the Palestinians, ought to recognize that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, it means, according to me, in real political terms, and everyone understands that the status quo that's created by these activities of Israel conceived by its rulers as the state of Jewish are okay. And so it's not really for me about whether it's democratic. It's about how much would have to be undone for us to approve.
Good evening, everybody. I'm really grateful to Frank for agreeing to moderate this. And as always, I'm extremely grateful to Duncan for inviting me to participate in this debate with him. We've done it several times before. It's always fascinating, and it's always fascinating in a different way each time. The way it's fascinating so far for me, already worth the price of admission, is that, usually my strategy in these things is sort of obvious. I sort of say, well, Duncan might be right in theory, but he can't possibly be right in practice. And then I sort of try to change the subject away from the theory. But this time, and this is why it's worth, to me, the price of admission already, Duncan's already made what I take to be all of the strongest counter-arguments that I could myself have made on the question of whether Israel is able to be a Jewish and democratic state in the most serious sense. And I'm actually tempted in my comments to raise the difficulty level and actually raise some of the challenges to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state that Duncan passed right over. And I want to do that for two reasons. I mean, the first is just straightforwardly intellectual honesty. The second is that the way I come at these issues, at least professionally, is having spent the last decade working on the topic of the Islamic and democratic state. And I take it as a serious challenge to the possibilities of the Islamic and democratic state that, for example, a state take the Sharia as the basis of all of its laws, or that it embrace and endorse Islam as the religion that its citizens ought normatively to belong to. And when I'm debating those topics, I don't pass them right over and say, oh, it's no problem, it's just a game of definitions. I think it's a serious concern. So I do want to at least spend a few minutes mentioning those challenges. I also want to mention one feature that may be less germane to the topic of the evening, but is nevertheless hugely significant in contemporary Israeli political discourse. Frank mentioned that the main challenge to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is the treatment of non-Jewish, especially of Palestinian citizens of the state. And I agree that that's the main show. But there's also the question in a Jewish and democratic state of the treatment of Jewish citizens of the state who think that the definition of Jewish in the definition of the state has gone too far in the direction of a Jewish halachic or legal definition, and who feel, for example, that the equality of the sexes in Israel is deeply compromised by the state's Jewish character. That's a major issue in Israel today. It's a front-page issue. So I want to at least mention those topics, and I'll touch on them only really very briefly, and then I'll respond to Duncan's central argument. So first, I would say that, in my view, it's only possible in a meaningful sense to be blank democratic, where the blank can be filled in by some ethnicity or religion or ethno-national religion or some combination of those things, if it respects fully the equality of citizens of the state who don't fit into the blank. And that may be trivial or obvious, but it does deserve to be said. What it means to respect the full equality of such citizens while acknowledging that they will have the experience of not belonging to the majority that has, through its majoritarian status, enacted its own close connection to the nature of the state, is a real problem. Simply the experience of exclusion is one that has to be taken seriously, and it includes symbolic issues, and these are significant to Palestinians. For example, the question of whether the national anthem should be Hatikva, a Hebrew poem that expresses the historical aspirations of the Jewish people to have a sovereign state in the place that to a Palestinian is his homeland or her homeland. That's not a small concern in my view. On the whole, the view that I've taken over the years and that I, on the whole, still think is right, is that symbolic features of the life of the state can be compatible with democratic equality, even when they exclude people, provided that they are truly open for political debate. And this already hints at one of the issues that Duncan raised. Provided that they are at least formally and in some sense practically open for discussion, and that to some degree, it's a limited degree, transforms the feeling of being a permanent loser that a minority will have in a political context. I borrow that phrase from Lani Guinier, among others. She was thinking of African Americans in the United States. So it changes the experience of being a permanent loser from a situation that fundamentally violates equal citizenship participation to one where the member of the minority group accepts that you win some and you lose some. You have the capacity for participating in politics, you win on some issues, you lose on some other issues. I don't claim that the view that I just expressed, which I, by the way, also think is relevant in the US domestic context with respect to religious symbols, I don't think that view is incontrovertibly correct at all. I think there's a reasonable argument, a strong reasonable argument to be made that the subjective experience of feeling excluded by religious symbols adopted by the majority derogates importantly from one's equal citizenship. I take that seriously. But I think that on the whole, we can satisfy a robust definition of democracy even in the presence of those symbols. Okay. So what I'm trying to do thus far is just acknowledge the seriousness of the challenge. I want to deepen that challenge with respect to the role of religion in the life of the state, even vis-a-vis Jewish citizens of the state, to the extent that they may believe that the state is derogating from their actual equality by virtue of defining itself religiously. So, I mean, there is an argument in Israel that what makes Israel a Jewish and democratic state includes respect for the mores of the ultra-Orthodox religious community, and that, for example, buses that separate men and women is consistent, the presence of such buses is consistent with the values of the Jewish and democratic state. And that view is not, from a jurisprudential Israeli standpoint, not crazy. I mean, in his opinion, in the Kvish Gea case, a case in which there was a debate about the use of a street, the blockage of a street, a major thoroughfare, on the Sabbath, Justice Aharon Barak, whom Frank alluded to earlier, who is at the far liberal extreme, the sort of person who believes that the Jewish part of Jewish and democratic is just abstract prophetic values of the kind that Duncan was recently embracing. I'm happy to hear.
It's the prophets.
Prophetic, I said. I said abstract prophetic values. Even Justice Barak said that the Israeli solution to this problem was a distinctive Israeli-style solution of Jewish and democratic, and that solution was a compromise, ultimately. And they did not resolve that case by saying, well, what do you mean you're blocking access to this public right-of-way because it's the Sabbath, when most Jewish Israelis want to travel on it? In fact, he accepted a compromise position, ultimately, describing it, validating it as a distinctive Israeli solution to part of Israel's Jewish and democratic state. In my view, if you're a woman living in Israel, it doesn't matter what your religious affiliation is or your ethnicity is, if you can't sit in the seat on the bus that you choose to sit in, because Israel is a Jewish state, according to some of its citizens, then the state is not functioning as a democratic state in the fullest sense of being egalitarian and democratic. And I would like to be on the record as thinking that, for what it's worth. Okay, now let me talk about Duncan's arguments, and I really see there being three main concerns in his expression. One was that the process of acquisition of land and control of that land by the state of Israel derogated from Israel's capacity to be Jewish, to be democratic. The second, that the political party arrangements in which, as a practical matter, Palestinian parties are not permitted to participate in the governing coalition, derogates from the possibilities of being a democratic state. And the third, that the justification, if I understand him correctly, within some political circles in Israel for the holding of the occupied territories is a further indication or a symbol of, or no, in some more than symbolic sense, in some practical sense, a derogation from the possibilities of being Jewish and democratic. So let me just take those three in turn and then I'll shut up. First, the land acquisition. I want to distinguish the acquisition from the way the land was subsequently managed and deployed. I think Duncan did the same thing. So Duncan noted correctly that after the UN's brokered, or unsuccessfully brokered, but proposed partition plan was accepted by the nation state of Israel, but was met by an invasion from surrounding countries, that 600,000 to 700,000 Palestinians fled or were coercively expelled, or I suspect in many cases some complex combination, from Israel, and that in the aftermath of that process, the Israeli state took over control of that land, the land that had belonged to Palestinians, via what I would call quasi-governmental organizations like the Jewish Agency, because after all, the Jewish Agency pre-existed the state of Israel, and then it postdated the state of Israel, but somewhere in there it became the state of Israel, while still maintaining some quasi-governmental identity. What Duncan says is historically correct. It's also not at all obvious what alternatives would have been available from the standpoint of the state, and we're now not talking about areas that are, we're talking about pre-67 borders. We're now not talking about areas that were under international law occupied by Israel, but rather areas that were legally recognized and remain legally recognized globally as part of Israel after the departure of those citizens. I suppose it is in principle conceivable that you could have a situation where after a war and a substantial population departure, you could call, it doesn't matter if you call it an expulsion or departure voluntarily for my purposes, you can hypothesize it purely, treat it purely as an expulsion. You could imagine a state that would then say, well, we don't really own 87% of our land. We're holding it in trust for the rightful owners who are gone. I suppose that is in principle theoretically possible. I think it would certainly be wildly unprecedented for a nation state attempting to establish its realistic capacity to function in the world, nor is it required as a matter of international law, so far as I'm able to make out, although I suppose we could talk about that. I suppose there might be an argument that could be made, but given that Israel's sovereignty, and I'm talking only about pre-1967 borders, is recognized as a matter of international law, I don't think an obligation to sustain that territory, to maintain that territory legally in trust for the people who had previously owned it is an international legal obligation. I also, to be honest with you, don't think it's a moral obligation, though I think that's a much more complex question. In any event, it's not inconsistent with being a democracy, because if it were, then it's not just, and I'm going to turn to the question of Brown against the Board of Education in a moment, but then it's not just that somehow pre-Brown the United States isn't a democracy, it's that the United States, and come to think of it, every country in the world that claims to be a democracy isn't a democracy, because they're all built, I think it's fair to say without exception, on foundations of systematic expansion and expulsion. Right? This is very obvious in the case of the United States, where the whole country in some sense was occupied by or belonged to Native Americans. And by the way, it's I put it hugely to Duncan's credit that he acknowledged this argument straightforwardly when saying that the United States, the same things we said of the United States, but let me just include Western Europe, just for the sake of argument. It's not as though France acquired the territory that is today France without 300 or 400 year process of expropriation and expulsion. The same could be true of said of every European country, and come to think of it, all the countries of Latin America. Stop me if I'm leaving anything out. So I don't think we want to set the conditions of what counts to be a democracy at a point where it's not sustainable for anybody. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm open to the view, and I think Ronald Dworkin, who is someone I respect enormously and was a very warm and generous colleague to me at NYU and who's quoted in the description here, sometimes Ronnie falls into the trap of thinking that democracy equals a perfectly just society. And he falls into this trap both ways. He thinks you can define democracy by its perfect justice, and he also thinks that any society that isn't perfectly just falls short of democracy. I think there's nothing wrong with that as an abstract position, but it's quite misleading when then you shift from the realm of abstract political philosophy into talking about real-world case studies, which I think Ronnie would be the first to acknowledge is not his strong suit. If you define democracy so demandingly, nothing will count as a democracy. That could be a good ethical stance. If I say you're not a democracy, then you'll try harder to become a democracy. And I don't object to that as an ethical stance, but I think it is at least confusing for purposes of discourse. The second part of what Duncan said, though, in this first point about land acquisition and control was about the land not being leasable or buyable by Palestinians. That was flatly wrong. It was flatly incompatible with egalitarian democracy, and the Israeli Supreme Court, as Duncan pointed out, said so about a decade ago in the Katsir case. Should it have taken that long? Of course not. Should the Katsir case be enforced? Yes. I'll go on the record as saying that the decisions of the Israeli High Court on this question absolutely should be enforced, and to the extent that they are not enforced, that's shameful, and it is a derogation from democracy. To the extent a state's highest court makes a crucial judgment about fairness and justice within its borders, and it's not enforced by the political authorities, that is a derogation from democracy, without any doubt. Now, I want to turn to the political parties in order to take on specifically Duncan's point about Brown. And this, I think, is a very hard problem. So Duncan said there was an agreement among the Israeli political parties that are dominated by Jews to exclude Palestinian political parties from governance. I think that's true in a sense and not true in another sense. I think it's true as a matter of real-world politics in Israel, that at those crucial moments when two factions in Israeli politics, and as you all know, Israeli parliamentary politics is a true disaster, are face to face and have to choose those last handful of votes that they're going to choose to form a government. They have been, since the very inception of the state, willing to go with ultra-Orthodox parties that are frankly not very deeply committed to democracy, and in some cases are actually openly anti-democratic, in some loose sense of the term, at least if it comes to the equality of women. But they have not been able in a similar situation, or not been willing rather in a similar situation, to turn to Palestinian parties. And if you ask why, then in the public discourse in Israel, they will say, well, we couldn't be a governing majority and make important decisions that affect the future of the Jewish state if part of the determining majority were Palestinian. That's a thing that is said. So Duncan is quite right in that sense to say that there is an implicit agreement. To the extent they are making that argument on the basis of the race or ethnicity of voters within the Israeli state, I believe that that viewpoint is incompatible with egalitarian democracy. That viewpoint is incompatible. To the extent they're making that claim on the basis of what they take to be, and in fact have actually been, the political positions of the Palestinian parties, it's not incompatible. And let me say why. If a majority within a state takes the view that it wants the state to remain a Jewish state with respect to the symbols of the state, with respect to the law of return, with respect to the various features that I think, maybe I'm wrong, I think Duncan conceded are compatible with democracy. And if it thinks that the presence within its governing majority of a party that doesn't agree with those things might lead to might lead to political decisions that would themselves lead to demographic changes that would change its majoritarian status, I don't think that that attitude, and we're talking about an attitude here, not a formal legal requirement, I don't think that attitude of trying to maintain the majoritarian status of the ethno-national majority is incompatible with democracy. And I similarly don't think that in an Islamic state, you had Muslim majority parties that refused to make a coalition with, say, secularist parties that were trying to remove the Islamic character of the state from the constitutional structure would be in some way a violation of democracy. I don't think it would be. And the reason, just to be very precise, has to do with the point I was making earlier about what it is to be a winner or a loser in democracy. If you're in coalition as a winner, and you do not want to bring into your coalition parties that disagree with your maintenance of your status as a winner, that is part of the rules of democracy. So to be very precise, what I'm saying is, if the attitude is no person, a party that represents people who are citizens but are not Jews, can't legitimately participate in politics, if that's the attitude, I don't think that's compatible with democracy in the deep sense. If, however, the attitude is we don't want political parties that will actively try to change our status as a majority, I don't think that that's incompatible. Now, compare this to the question of Brown. I mean, Duncan said the United States and Israel are comparable with respect to the way things were pre-Brown. I actually think they're more comparable with the way things are post-Brown. I mean, in Israel, you don't have, with respect to Palestinian citizens of the state, formal legal discrimination. You do have lots of de facto discrimination. So that seems like the world post-Brown, in which we have deep and systematic inequalities in the United States with respect to the treatment of African Americans, disparate devotion of resources, as Duncan acknowledged, disparate capacities for employment. You know, nobody thinks that just because a distinguished graduate of this law school who's an African American is president of the United States, that discrimination is gone with respect to African Americans, and I think that's quite right, and it's a serious problem, and I think it's true in Israel as well. I'm not one of those people who thinks that makes us not a democracy. Okay. Last point, and I think the second point is the hardest point, I would say. The third point, I think, is a little bit less difficult, and that's the question of the territories, and I'll just speak to it very briefly, because I know that my time is up. I'm not sure I fully understand Duncan's position. Maybe I'll turn this into a question to Duncan. Sure. If it's your view that the taking of the territories in the 1967 war was not a feature of Jewishness, and if it's your view that there could be a political view according to which those territories are held for pragmatic reasons of defense, is it your view that just because there are some people in Israel, maybe including Benjamin Netanyahu, who think that the justification for the possession of those lands is that they serve somehow the fundamentally Jewish character of the land between the Jordan and the sea, that justification for the situation, even among people like Netanyahu, who claim that they would also be willing, under the right conditions, to cede those territories, is it just the justification for holding them in what these parties at least claim is temporary, enough to shift the state into a state that cannot be Jewish and democratic? Because to me, it just sounds like a state in which the rationale for justification is inspired by some people for this particular policy, is inspired by a view that's kind of doubtful, in my view, but doesn't seem like it's a violation of the relationship between Jewishness and democracy. So the analogy would be, the Mexican-American War, and we take some Mexican territory, and there are people in the United States who believe as a matter of manifest destiny that this territory ought to belong to them. And that does have something to do with America as being a Protestant, white people's place where people speak English, they're Anglo-Saxon and so forth. Okay, it's not a view I like. It is a view that many people held. it's not obvious to me how it's a violation of the underlying features of the democratic nature of the state.
So can I treat that as a question?
Yeah, please. It was meant to be, sincerely.
You can treat that as a question, and if you want to put a question
Back.
to Professor Feldman, you can do that too.
So I guess I really don't think about this in terms of the question of what elements of the Israeli state, which are easily identified as caused by dimensions of its Jewishness, are or are not compatible with democracy. So from my point of view, not a lot hinges on that. But let me say what the way the occupied territories part of the argument works for me. I think your question was a good one because what I said was pretty quick and vague. So let me try to be more specific. The way I see it, the state of Israel rules the West Bank and is still a true occupier of Gaza in spite of, and you might not disagree with that. I mean,
Gaza's a complex question, but I agree with respect to the West Bank, obviously.
So for the West Bank, Israel rules the West Bank. The Israeli government is the government of the West Bank. There are some Bantustans, but the Israeli government is the government of the West Bank. It administers its criminal code as 25,000 pages long so that it's more than any human being could ever master. It administers it on the ground down to the smallest detail. And this is a state activity of governance which is motivated by a conception of Jewishness, I would argue, but that's at the relatively vague level that you're describing. But I think it's completely implausible to say today that Israeli public opinion has the view that they are temporarily holding the occupied territories while waiting to be able to give them back, and they're only doing it for security reasons. I just don't think that is a description of any aspect of the Israeli discourse at the moment. I would say quite the contrary, that there is a big conflict in Israel about the occupied territories, but it's a conflict about how they can be let go in a way that will be consistent with the demographic agenda. Mm-hmm. So for me, the problematic dimension of the occupation is the way, it's the fact that they rule the occupied territories in a, what I would say it is easy to say, is a radically undemocratic, authoritarian, racial, and brutal way. So this is the Israeli state occupying and governing as the government. It's like the government of Massachusetts. If Vermont were governing Massachusetts the way Israel governs Massachusetts, you might say Vermont is democratic because the Vermont legislature is deciding all these things and they only want to hold Massachusetts for a little while. They'd love to give it back to the Massachusetts people, but the concrete regime is unbelievably open. I'm not into the semantics. It's open to question from the point of view of a number of different ideas of democratic values. Again, it's, for me, not a legality question. I would say they've de facto annexed the West Bank. That I would say that in correct legal terminology, they have de facto annexed the West Bank. Therefore, they are in violation of the fundamental tenets of the UN Charter. But that's not important to me. It's not a legalistic question.
Can I respond very briefly to that?
Yeah, of course.
So the first thing I would say is I think that was helpful clarification, but if I understand you correctly, your third point actually doesn't go to the question of can Israel be a Jewish and democratic state simultaneously. It goes to the question of whether you can run an occupation that began in 1967. I was born in 1970. I'm going to be 42 soon, and this started 3 years before I was born. It's proportionally the history of the state of Israel. It's a bigger and bigger proportion, and I take it you're raising the separate, totally legitimate but separate question of whether if you are administering an occupation that does not proceed along democratic lines, as no occupation ever does, and if you're doing it quasi-permanently, can you be a democracy? That seems like a very legitimate and fair question. It does, I just want to say clearly, it's not the same as the question of can you be a Jewish and democratic state. And again, it's to your credit to have said, this has got nothing to do with Jewishness. I agree. So that's a separate topic. It's a worthwhile topic to discuss. I don't know, to be honest with you, exactly what I think the correct answer to that question is, except to say the following. It's definitely true that vis-a-vis the Palestinian territories, the occupied territories, Israel is not a democratic state and acknowledges that it is not. I mean, I think that's clear. There is no democracy in the occupied territories, and Israel does not claim that there is. I mean, that raises the whole deep, profound, and lengthy debate, which I think we're not going to have tonight, about what should happen with the territories. We've talked about it in previous years, and we both have views on it. But it's not the same as the question of Jewish and democratic.
I completely agree with that, sort of. But now my question. So here's my question. This is really a question. So I don't mean this is not a debater's question. In this topic, one of the things that's most fascinating to me is the way in which in conversations there's a religious way of talking about it and thinking about it where the question is Jewishness understood as a religion or as the religion of a group. So it's a religion of a group, and then, so this is the kind of thing that Dworkin is very preoccupied, that Frank is also interested in. You, in your Islamic State thing, are very interested in. But you also acknowledge, or you bring into your discourse from time to time, the category of ethno-nationalism. So the category, and I was struck by the fact that you do actually have that as part of your analysis of what's going on is ethno-nationalism. So the question there is the question about is about the relationship, this is the question for me, the historical relationship between ethno-nationalism and relatively thin definitions of democracy is quite a different question than the question of Jewish religion or Judaism as the religion of the prophets and democracy. So ethno-nationalism is a word developed to describe by the critics of the State of Israel. So ethno-nationalism as a way to characterize the Israeli regime is a way of talking about its Jewishness that will sharply distinguish that from its religious character. Because you can be an ethno-nationalist Jewish atheist. It has nothing to do with your religious orientation because ethno-nationalism as an identity doesn't depend on any one characteristic. So you can be an ethno-nationalist, atheist, immigrant to Israel from New York who is only 1/4 Jewish, as long as you meet the law of return requirements. So how do you see the relationship between Israeli ethno-nationalism and the question of democracy, as opposed to the religion question?
So I was using the term...
I've never asked you this question before, and we've never discussed it before.
Yeah, true. I was using the term, as I hope, as descriptively as possible to capture nationalisms, and Zionism as a form of as a kind of nationalism, that are based on the idea that there is some ethnic group that constitutes the nation. Right? What the Israeli Declaration of Independence and much early Zionist literature calls Ha'am HaYehudi, the Jewish nation. There's only one way really to translate the word Am in that context, it's nation, although sometimes one hears people used as translation. So, the early Zionists were overwhelmingly secularists and overwhelmingly atheists. And their own self-conception of the state, the Jewish state, was not that it would be religiously Jewish. And in fact, one of the arguments, the sort of internal to the Jewish communities in Israel's arguments about what it is to be a Jewish and democratic state is, does the Jewish part have any religious content at all? Or is it purely a description of peoplehood? Okay, so first I was just trying to use the term descriptively. I also think that, the German state is in many relevant respects an ethno-national state. Now, Germany has been grappling with this question over the years. For some time, Germany had its own version of the law of return. It still has it. Where if you can trace your ancestry to a person who was a German citizen at the relevant time, you can get German citizenship in a highly expedited fashion. I have some friends who have done this. So we're not talking about your father or your grandfather necessarily, but you could go back many more generations than that, and then you can get citizenship. Similarly, on the flip side of this, Germany for a long time, and there have been some mild improvements in this regard, had a principle whereby if you were, say, a Turkish worker who lived in Germany, and you'd live there for a generation, and then your children were born there, and then their children were born there, they still weren't Germans. Okay, so that's an ethno-nationalist state in the sense that I'm describing. Okay. Can a state be ethno-nationalist in those terms and be compatible with democracy? In my view, the answer is yes. I don't think that it's a requirement of, I don't think it should be a principled requirement of counting as a fully egalitarian democracy that you define your membership in your polity by some initially neutral criterion. I don't. The United States, when you look at our immigration policy, consistently has favored, whether it's white people or skilled laborers or countries where people are not from majority Muslim countries in the latest incarnation, you name it. You name the bias, we've had it in our immigration policy. Someday there'll be new biases, and those will be in our immigration policies. The threshold question of who gets to be a member of the state is a very important moral question. It's not, in my view, a question that goes to the nature of what is a democracy. To me, a democracy has to do with the treatment of people who live within the state and also with the status of citizens who live inside that state. Does that mean, by the way, that I would argue that such a thing is desirable? No, I don't think it's desirable, frankly, but I do think it's compatible with democracy.
So I'm going to get in here now because I have a question. I have a question for Noah, and then maybe I'll put one to Duncan as well. This just follows right on what you've been saying, and it picks up from your disagreement with Duncan. This is an iteration of your disagreement with Duncan. I understood you to say in your initial presentation that you believe it's true that Israel's way of conducting itself as a Jewish state does impose some, I'll call them dignitary burdens, on non-Jewish citizens. That's really the question. Unlike Dworkin, you're prepared to accept some measure of imposition of dignitary burden of that kind in a, what shall we call it, globally realistic conception of a regime that measures up to a standard of a relatively robust standard of democracy that you would accept. But you know that maybe it's enough I just restate your position and that's it. But there's a question there, Noah. Once you say there's a burden of a dignitary kind that results to citizens, it wouldn't just be of Israel viewed as an ethno-national state, but citizens of any state that would be identified by the people living within it as having an ethno-national character. That might, by the way, cover the United States in spite of the First Amendment, because there might be any number of people sitting in this room who experience life in the United States as life in a Christian nation.
Yes. So I've tried. This is a topic question that's come up again and again in everything that I've written, pretty much, and I've tried to be consistent on it across different venues. So let me just take the example of your last example. You're in a public school in the United States, and other people are praying in the classroom. Okay? Now, I'm not now talking about whether you can be compelled to recite the prayer yourself. In my view, you can't be required to engage in such an act of loyalty to prove your citizenship. And this goes to one of the questions Duncan mentioned. There's sometimes talk in Israel of a mandatory loyalty oath for Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel. And that seems to me a mandatory oath for people who are already citizens of a state to remain citizens seems to me to be a violation of democratic equality. It hasn't been adopted, and I hope it never will be, but such a thing has been proposed. It's important to mention it. So take the situation now of the student who's not praying himself, but the other kids are praying. And I've gotten probably more flack for saying this than almost anything else that I've ever said anywhere, so let me just say it again and take new flack for it. I can see that it's undesirable. I can see that, as Justice O'Connor says, it sends a message that you are an outsider, not a favored member of the political community. I get that. I don't want to pretend that there's no subjective experience. But being a citizen of a democratic state entails frequently being in situations where the majority have made a series of important, substantive, symbolic decisions that only affect you at the level of your dignity or your symbolism, which you deeply disagree with. The state in my name does many things I detest, and that should be true for each and every one of us. And it can happen at a systematic level where I always lose. I am a radical atheist, and I always lose on this topic, let's imagine. Right? I'm a Jewish child in a majority Christian school. I'm always going to lose on this question. Yes, that is a feature. It is a constitutive feature of democracy that people who are on the losing side of an issue in a recurrent way will feel bad that they're always losing. And they can always plausibly, I don't want to be unsympathetic, plausibly express that as a dignitary harm. Because it's harmful to one's dignity to always lose. It's like being on I have a basketball team like this, and it's harmful to my dignity. Right? I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. It is really harmful to dignity always to lose. But it is not constitutively a factor of democratic citizenship that one be guaranteed the opportunity to win some percentage of the time. That's a nice idea, but it is not a constitutive feature of democratic citizenship.
Great. Now I've got a question for Duncan. This is not really, the spirit of this question is not to challenge anything you've said, but this is a pursuit of some clarification, maybe to get you to say a little bit more about what you see as the relationship, if any, between Israel's claim and pursuit of the Jewish character of the state on the one hand, and certain shortfalls from democracy that you detect on the other hand, right? So we have these observed shortfalls. Loyalty oaths, political exclusion, discriminatory state policies and distributions, and Jim Crow-style social reality. These are shortfalls from democracy. And we have, let's say, a fairly robust conception of Israel as a Jewish state. We can take Professor Gavazon's conception. Israel understood as the state where the Jewish people or the Jewish nation is politically self-determining, something like
Stable and permanent large
Right.
majority.
Okay, yes,
That was
stable-
her definition.
right. Okay.
Stable, permanent, large,
Okay.
a demographic criterion of Jewishness,
I got
a
it.
racial demographic criterion of Jewishness.
Now, the question that I want to put to you is whether, well, let me put it this way. One might ask whether that dedicatedly Jewish character of the state is, in a strict sense, a determining cause of the shortfalls from democracy that you detect in Israeli law and Israeli society. I think your answer, I believe you answered that question, no, it's not. But there's a question that then immediately comes to mind for some people, which is, all right, it's not in any strict sense a determining cause. One can imagine a state of affairs in which we have this dedicatedly Jewish character on the one hand and complete cure and rectification of the shortfalls of democracy
I
on the
like
other.
that you're smiling as you present the hypo. Yes.
But I think that's your view as well. It's my understanding of what you said. But what you didn't go on to talk about is whether you see some kind of tendentious or affinity relationship, right, between Israel's claim and pursuit of her Jewish character on the one hand and the shortfalls from democracy that you detect on the other hand. You simply didn't address yourself to that, and I'm now giving you a chance for 2 minutes to do so.
Thanks. Not enough. If that question could be just put as, to what do you attribute these shortfalls? So I don't believe in causal explanations of this kind of regime constitution that are ever single factor explanations. But the reason for my question to Noah was actually to open the question of whether we don't focus way too much on questions like Jewishness and democracy, thinking of Jewishness as a category of religion or spirituality or dedication to an ethical conception. Or I think to understand Israeli politics, for me, the category of ethno-nationalism is important because I think we can say more about it than was implicit in Noah's very thin definition. That is an historical matter, ethno-nationalism as it has existed in the modern world has had dark sides and light sides. There have been ethno-nationalisms that have been relatively benign, but also the characteristics the characteristic or the typical ethno-national movements and regimes, when they have gained power, they've had somewhat similar dark sides. So I think Noah was absolutely correct to mention Germany. So it would be a typical question, to what extent is Nazism and the Holocaust caused by German ethno-nationalism? And I certainly would not answer that question by saying German ethno-nationalism caused it, period. But there are no explanations of World War II, Nazism, and the Holocaust that don't include ethno-nationalism as a major component of the story. So ethno-nationalism is something, and it's also right that a basic aspect of American, British, and French identity, according to me, is rejection of ethno-nationalism as the basic concept of citizenship, although everything you said about biased immigration policy, every kind of bias is everywhere in the system. But when people say every people has a right to the people, to a state, and to run the state, and to have a secure large majority of the state that corresponds to their race. It's not their religion, it's their conception of their race. Alarm bells go off.
Can I?
Sure.
Isn't that the exact same argument as the totally, in my view, legitimate Palestinian argument for self-determination? Are they distinguishable?
Absolutely, but no. I didn't make an argument for self-determination. What I'm saying is there's a social phenomenon, a social cultural phenomenon, which we can roughly call ethno-nationalism. A lot of Palestinians are ethno-nationalists. But what we're talking about is when we're looking at the state creation of a regime, and by the way, just put a factual bracket, there's one thing that I left out, and you left out too, with the land regime is not, they occupied, they kicked out the Palestinians. What were they supposed to do? Just stay there and trust? No, they kicked them out, and then from the very first day didn't let them come back in. So Palestinians who were not combatants and had nothing to do with the war were prohibited from returning to Israel. So they created their custody of the lands regime, but it wasn't a question of whether they had to have trusteeship and just keep it vacant waiting for those people to come back. They prohibited them to come back, and they nationalized them immediately through the quasi-state institutions, and they handed them over to the Jewish population. That's the foundation of the second-class citizenship of the Palestinians to this day. The wealth of the remaining population, then the 150,000 who were left, half of them lost their land too. So the basic idea, that's a pattern. I mean, that's not the first time that's ever happened in history. And by the way, the Mexican-American War is an excellent example. I mean, I completely buy that analogy. It's a powerful one. So ethno-nationalism is a thing in history, and in so much as Jewish ethno-nationalism has had enormous influence on the Jewish state, I would say it is part of the responsibility for the democracy deficits that you've listed. So to understand Israeli politics, to some extent, I understand it as a struggle of the forces of light against the elements of Israeli ethno-nationalism that are always bubbling under the surface, and the same for the Palestinians. Exactly the same for the Palestinians. There is a tragic danger of Palestinian ethno-nationalism that would be just as bad.
Content? You want to?
We can keep on going, so you should say something.
No, I'm not going to say. We've got a short time, 10 minutes, for interventions from in front of us. Nimmer, are there microphones out there, or do people just have to stand up and yell? Sir, stand up so that we can all hear you, and speak up.
I'd like you to speak to what's happening right now in Jerusalem with the active expulsion of some of the original Jerusalem residents, and how is that compatible with the democracy notion?
Because it's inside Israel, according to the Israeli state. You know what I'm going to say. I don't know what you're going to say.
Well, I would have thought that what I was going to say is pretty straightforward. I mean, to the extent that in some Jerusalem neighborhoods, I think that a reasonably well-informed observer could think that Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel have been forced to leave their homes under claims of security as part of an overall project of consolidating Jewish presence in those neighborhoods, I think that is a violation of their legal rights, and I think it's also a violation of their democratic egalitarian rights. That said, and I believe that, and I think a lot of Israelis who have participated in protests against some of these developments tend to agree as well. Note, however, that there is a lot of complexity to this issue, and I don't want to say this in an apologetic mode, but I think it is actually true. So there is this question of what to do about Jewish Israelis who want to move into Palestinian majority neighborhoods within Jerusalem because they believe, as a matter of their own typically religio-nationalist commitment, they've merged, some of these folks have merged ethno-nationalism with religion, and sometimes it's messianist and mystical, just to add that on top, that God wants them to live there. So there are many Israelis that I know of who, leftist Israelis, who think that those Jews should not be allowed to move into those places. Right? And I'm talking now about people who are, for example, offering a large sum of money to buy homes. It's hard for me to explain how in a democratic state you could formally prohibit that. Hard for me to explain that. Does it seem right to approach someone who's poor and offer them a great deal of money for their home and then move into that home? Of course, it's troubling in certain respects, but it is also part of the ordinary way of doing business in a democratic state. And in some cases, that is also happening. And a lot of the population movement in some Jerusalem neighborhoods, is driven by features like that one. And I don't think there's a simple way to say that. I think one wants to be even-handed, if possible, with respect to the question of the conditions.
I think that, I guess it's Khalidi has described brilliantly the Judaization of Jerusalem policies of the Israeli government. They exist on 19 different dimensions, from how long it takes to get your residence permit renewed, to family reunification, to what happens if you leave the city for 15 minutes, to not just zoning, but the authorization of new homes. I would say that that policy is the prime example of religio-ethno-nationalism inside the State of Israel. And if you are American and you just read the description of the complex of policies that are used to get the Arabs out of Jerusalem and prevent them from coming back, you would be horrified.
Someone from this side? Sir?
Just wondering if you could relate to, since there is no argument about the historic facts, to the Palestinian citizens of Israel as an indigenous minority and the kinds of protections that international law gives and the barriers that it has. I know that Turkish immigrants to Germany is the right reference in this case.
Do you want to speak to that? Yeah, you talk about that in your class, right?
I know very little about the international law of protection of indigenous peoples. I think it is correct to understand them as a national minority. They're not the same, the specific form of minority fits that pattern, but I don't feel prepared to speak to that legal issue, which I think is an interesting one I should know about, and I don't.
So I just want to say that I wasn't suggesting, by the way, that the right and I don't think I even specifically made the comparison of Turkish immigrants to Germany. I was talking about the nature of ethno-nationalism, and I was demonstrating Germany as an ethno-national state using a particular example. I wasn't speaking about the situation of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and live inside of Israel. That wasn't an analogy I meant to draw. With respect to indigenous minority rights, I think it's quite plausible to the extent that those rights are recognized in international law, and they are under some conditions, to think about those rights as applying to Palestinians. But there is an issue there that would presumably be a major political issue in Israel, which goes to the question of indigeneity, right? I mean, the definition of indigeneity is a hard topic in international law, a hard and unresolved topic in international law. And there would certainly be voices within Israel saying that some percentage of the Jewish population in Israel, relatively small percentage, but a percentage, was itself indigenous, and that there had been continuous Jewish settlement in Israel for, since there were people who were called Jews, either by themselves or others. So, that's another issue that would have to be taken into account in balancing and considering those questions.
In back. You'll have to speak up.
database institutions, I don't see why a democracy couldn't be also compatible with the exclusion of women from participation, provided that women have the right to express their dissent.
Well, then I didn't express myself clearly enough. My view wasn't, first of all, I don't think, I know for a fact I didn't use the word toleration. Second of all, I don't think that a democracy can tolerate the, to use your phrase, systematic exclusion of minorities from features of public life. I think first of all, there must be formal equal citizenship. Second of all, there must be substantive equal citizenship measured by one's capacity to participate in the institutions of public life. Now, that raises the question of whether if you vote for a topic on a position and you and those who are like you always lose in the democratic state, you are therefore, that state of affairs derogates from democratic equality, and there are reasonable people who think it does. There are people who think there must be set-asides in the state, for example, for people who will otherwise always lose, otherwise they are not truly equal. And I'm disagreeing with that view. I don't think that just because I and others on some dimension, atheists in the United States would be I don't mean to trivialize, but it's a meaningful example to many people.
I'm an atheist, so you're speaking for me.
Okay.
Or about
you know, will always, in the world that we have known and continue to know, lose, right? That it follows that they are excluded from democratic outcomes, even though, you know, not only for this reason, but Duncan can't get elected president of the United States, right? I mean, you know, imagine President Obama, the exact same person, and now imagine him saying when he was asked about religion, not, I am a born-again Christian, which is more or less what he said, or I have been born again through Jesus Christ and he died for my sins, but rather, I am an atheist. Okay, he couldn't have been elected president of the United States. He would have been excluded. Systematically, I don't know, but de facto, absolutely. That does not mean that atheists are not equal citizens of the United States for purposes of democracy.
All right, I'm going to go to the back on this side, and this is the last, I think this is probably going to be the last one we have time for.
Okay, thanks. So I'm curious about the link between democracy and demographics. So in Israel, but also in Europe, there is a fear that in 100 years, Israel is not going to be majority Jewish, or Germany is not going to be majority German or ethnic German, or even the United States in 100 years will not be majority ethnically white. So I'm curious as to, from the perspective of the present, to what extent are interventions in order to avoid that demographic change consistent with democratic principles?
That's a very good question. I think this question is tied to the discussion of ethno-nationalism in a very direct way, because it's been characteristic of movements that everybody would describe as ethno-national since the end of the 19th century, that they have been very preoccupied with demographics. Demographics has played a giant role in ethno-national ideologies all over the world, and particularly the idea of the racial threat. So American ethno-nationalism, preoccupied with the Irish, with Jews. So ethno-nationalism in the United States has had a very strong demographic preoccupation. And today you can read, you know, when will minorities be a majority in the United States? Well, day after tomorrow. Policy driven by the demographic preoccupation of ethno-national movements could be democratic. It would be perfectly possible to pursue demographic policies, and very much in the NOAA mode. So it would be within the democratic rules of the game to do various things that are designed to preserve the racial majority. However, history suggests that it has been repeatedly the case that ethno-national demographic preoccupations have led to demographic solutions that nobody would consider to be compatible with democracy. So I'm putting that incredibly mildly and obliquely. Demographic preoccupations of ethno-national regimes have often been associated with or led to demographic policies of ethno-national states that are hardly compatible with democracy. Now, that's not just Germany we're talking about. It's also Serbia. There are many, many examples of it. Now, I don't think that the Israeli government has yet done anything in its demographically oriented policies that merits comparison with those catastrophic things. Nothing like that has happened. However, the demographic motive in Israeli legislation is becoming more and more prominent, as every follower of Israeli politics knows. And the demographic motive is linked to exclusion, not to extermination, but to exclusion and also to the occupation. So the occupation, big issue in the occupation is if you end it, there's going to be, what are you going to do? But the family reunification policy in Israel is now obviously justified by most people who are trying to figure out what's going on. It's a demographic thing, which is you prevent married people who are on the two sides of the Green Line from living together on the and in Jerusalem, it's a major aspect of Jerusalem policy because you have a demographic motive. It's troubling. I'm not saying it's fascist, because I don't think it is, but it's troubling for and history does not suggest that we should take lightly the intense demographic preoccupations of the Israeli right today.
I just want to say two things about that. The first is that I'm also troubled by the way that in much of Western Europe, and especially in Northern Europe, population policy is also being driven by expressly Islamophobic and xenophobic policies, where it goes right down to encouraging Swedish citizens to have more citizens by giving them to have more children by giving them major subsidies for children, which we all know what that's motivated by in part. Right? It's clearly motivated by the thought that they want more, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Swedes. I mean, my point is not that this is okay from an ethical standpoint, but what I want to point out is that there is no democracy that I know of that hasn't gerrymandered its immigration and even probably its population policies, its reproductive policies, in the hopes of achieving certain demographic outcomes. So the worry about ethno-national states is well taken. But one could be worried about other kinds of states as well in this regard. And I just want to say one last thing about this, because I think the question is a really important one. I don't think we talked about it as directly as I would have liked. I don't want to fall afoul of Abe Foxman's statement that Duncan quoted by accidentally talking about the apparently inherently illegitimate topic of what should happen if Israel were not a Jewish state. But it is very common in Israel to hear people across the political spectrum say that the reason to focus on the demographic issue is that they want Israel to be both Jewish and democratic. And they say openly, if Israel should have a majority population, I'm talking now about citizens of Israel, who were themselves Palestinian and not Jewish, both Palestinian and not Jewish, then Israel could no longer be a Jewish state and a democracy. So I suppose when people say that, they're already violating Abe Foxman's commandment, but they are saying something which I believe to be true, which is that if you have a state where an electoral majority chooses for the state no longer to be Jewish or Islamic or what have you, and then the institutions of the state say, sorry, you may have a majority and you may have voted for this using ordinary legal means, but we won't let that happen. At that point, say what you will about that state, it won't be able to make a claim anymore that it is in fact democratic. So, and that is not something that, as the questioner points out, is not something that's unimaginable. So, to the extent that a state is trying to avoid that scenario by legal means, my own view is that it's still playing within the rules of democracy, even construed in a fairly robust sense.
Okay, I would like to thank Duncan and Noah and you. That was terrific. Very good.
You were great.
Frank,
This was
thank
good.
you. That's good.
I thought it was good.
Thank you, Frank. I think you put us on a much higher intellectual plane than we usually are. That was good.
No, I don't think so.
No, it was.
No, you did.
Yeah.
You have to compare to the previous times.
Yeah.
Neither of us played to the crowd. We both wanted to impress you, so we both tried to be serious.